I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Andy Brittlebank, Associate Dean at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who helped me prepare this presentation. And what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes or so is actually take you through some of the principles which we need to bear in mind when we're talking about training the trainers. And some of it is quite self-evident, and it fits in quite nicely with the earlier presentation we heard about the difference between mentors and good psychiatrists. I think we do know that adults in particular learn best when we learn in a comfortable environment along with our peers, and when we are involved in planning of the process. We hate being told that you will go and learn this or you will go and read this. We want to decide what is good for our professional development and then try and identify sources, and therefore taking a degree of control in what we do, how we identify the resources, but at the same time being aware that support is needed and support is available, and knowing where to go for that support. Any kind of managed learning has to be very specific with very clear outcomes. It has to be measurable, and it has to be possible that you can attain it. And the best learning is without too much extra effort, that you can learn at your place of work with formal or informal learning opportunities and with planned leave. But also it's quite significant that any kind of learning has to take into account that it has to be relevant to what you're doing day to day. There's no point learning something which you're going to learn today and forget tomorrow. So for trainees, equally, the learning has to be managed and training centered, has to be service-based, at the same time flexible and with sort of clear coaching and structured. Kolb's learning cycle tells us that it's a sort of ongoing process, that you kind of, by shadowing a senior manager, you get concrete experience of particular kind of management or learning. You then at some point discuss these observations in supervision and reflect on them, which lead on to some kind of abstract conceptualization of what you've learned. And you may then go back and read and then try and experiment and change your practice according to what you've read, what you've seen, and then get involved in a sort of project. I've just put down service development, but it could be anything there. So it's an ongoing process. So you can actually start with reflective observation and then go on to abstract conceptualization and then active experimentation. So it's an ongoing cycle, and you can join it at any particular stage. And as I said earlier, that you need to look at the needs for the learning, the objectives, the methods, and any learning you have to constantly review as to whether you're meeting your learning objectives, what needs to change, how that's going to be changed, and what needs to replace it. In the UK, every psychiatric trainee has mandatory supervision for 1 hour per week with their educational supervisor. And unusually, the agenda for this is set by the trainee, not by the supervisor, and they can talk about anything that they choose to. In addition, there are learning opportunities for psychotherapy in supervision and seeing cases through journal clubs, case conferences, audit meetings, courses, study leaves, etc. And all these are recorded in logbooks with reports from completed audits and research projects. And all of this, we're in the process of developing e-portfolio for trainees and for consultants. So everything will be on the college website, and people can access their own learning portfolio as well as that of their trainees. And there are ethical and confidentiality issues that we're struggling with at the moment, but I'll come back to that because that is something that we need to bear in mind. And some of this learning and formal evaluation is through workplace-based assessments, and I'll mention that later on. Exams focus pretty well on knowledge and competencies, but also over the last 18 months or so, Within the UK, we've introduced multi-source feedback for trainees, as well as it will become mandatory for consultants, because the GMC expects us to go down the revalidation route probably in 2010, 2011. So supervision is defined as overseeing the actions or work of a person. And clinical supervision is quite different from educational supervision. So clinical supervision is supervising on clinical matters appropriate to the level of experience and competence of the trainees. And those supervising clinical care must be readily available, competent to do so, accessible and approachable. And these are the recommendations of PMET-B, which is the Postgraduate Medical Education Training Board, which is now responsible for setting standards for training and issuing certificates for completion of training. For clinical supervision, the guidelines are in the college's Basic Specialist Training Handbook, and I'm not going to go through those. But educational supervision, again, it's within the Basic Specialist Training Handbook. It's mandatory, as I said, regular basis for 1 hour per week, which is timetabled in the trainee's weekly timetable. It belongs to the trainee and should be used for educational rather than clinical purposes, and should not be delegated except when on leave. Each trainee agrees with the educational supervisor at the beginning of their placement as to what they want out of that placement, and they have further meetings with their clinical tutors or with training program directors, as well as the educational supervisor. At the end of 6 months of placement, trainees have to write a report on their placement with me, for example, as to what the job was like, whether they got what they wanted. And I have to do a similar report on the trainee. Now, the interesting thing is the trainee can see my report on him, but I can't see the trainee's report on me. But that goes to the college tutor, and it goes to the training program director. And if I'm not behaving myself, the college tutor or the training program director will take me to one side and say, if you don't change, we won't send you a trainee anymore. And it is basically working with the trainee to develop and facilitate an educational plan which meets their educational needs. As a supervisor, I know what the gaps in their training are, what the gaps in their competencies are, but we have to agree that what I see is the right thing. And therefore, throughout those sessions, there is a role for pastoral and career counseling and practical and emotional support. And within the educational supervision, there are rules and boundaries, the timing and the flexibility and learning objectives. And as I said earlier, liaising with the college tutor, director of medical education, program director, or the training school. Now, the relationship with the trainee in the educational supervision is a matter of attitude. How I treat my trainee and how he or she treats me. It's mutual respect, and it's a constructive and contemporaneous feedback. But basically, certainly in the UK, psychiatrists have not been very good at giving feedback to the trainees. And that's one of the things in workplace-based assessments, that as soon as you have somebody, the feedback has to be immediate there and then. And increasingly, there is an expectation that there will be records kept of the session. Now, it's quite time-consuming, it's quite problematic, it raises all kinds of ethical questions and confidentiality issues as to who keeps those notes, where they are kept, are they locked, who has access to them. And quite often, the best way of doing it is to agree with the trainee at the beginning of the session, this is what we are going to be discussing, and you jot down things that you want to discuss and jot down the kind. It's not minutes of the meeting, but the key points which were discussed. And then the trainee can make a note of those, and I as a supervisor can agree or disagree with them. So within the session, you discuss education, you discuss interpersonal skills, you discuss clinical skills, but not clinical matters. You discuss managerial skills, managing time, negotiating, chairing committees, etc. And you talk about personal development in terms of their career plans, and if they require, I mean, most training schemes would have a research tutor who would provide supervision for research matters. But if they want to discuss research or audit matters in the educational supervision session, they can do so. And as I said earlier, pastoral care is quite an important part of the relationship. And when we asked a number of consultants to raise their concerns about educational supervisions in a survey, issues that emerged were issues to do with time, setting that time aside, and then if you're jotting down notes or if you're making notes that needs more time, and uncertainties over boundaries, that if you are both educational and clinical supervisor for a trainee, where you stop, how do you give effective feedback, how do you help an unwell trainee or a struggling trainee, and how do you balance, and that's one of the issues that we have when we are mentoring, and certainly in the UK, all newly appointed consultants have to have a mentor for the first 3 years of their consultancy. And I mentored 2 consultants. That's much less frequent. We meet up every 6 months or so, generally in an informal manner. But there is the worry about being too directive or being facilitatory, and that sort of falls into the educational supervision bit as well. And again, the issue struggle between trainee autonomy and line management. And obviously there's a conflict between service needs and training needs, and which take precedence. And also whether these sessions can be used as monitoring or checking up. And issues related to workplace-based assessments, time and feedback have become much more important. Trainees see somebody as an ideal supervisor, somebody who provides regular assessment and appraisal of skills, provides constructive criticism, is personally supportive, is aware of educational environment, and is aware of the curriculum. Basically a critical friend who can be contacted easily, and is also aware of what's going on in weekly teaching programs so that they can support the trainee, and agreement on educational plans, which I've already covered. So within the UK, although it is mandatory, there have been various surveys which have indicated that it doesn't always occur 100% of the times in 100% of the places. Not a surprise. But it's quite interesting that 87% of supervisors think that they provide supervision, and only 69% of trainees think that they get supervision. So make what you will of that. Interestingly, because trainees are interested in passing the exams, they complain that only 60% of supervisors are aware of examination requirements. So in clinical supervision, I think identifying the supervisee or the trainee and being aware of their level of training and competence, identifying the objectives, giving feedback. And I'm not going to cover this, but it's just looking at the research models, what needs to be done. So as far as the trainer is concerned, the trainer must meet the trainee quite early and help with induction to the post, because we've got induction to the scheme, induction to the subject, and then induction to the place where you're working. And trainee and trainer need to agree on the purpose and the use of supervision and the learning objectives, as well as construct a learning agreement, and with regular review and feedback. So trainer, as we heard in the mentoring process, needs to be an observer and a reflector, be able to provide information, be able to identify alternatives to the trainees' problems, be a facilitator, and work with the trainee to provide problem solving and counseling and negotiating, and be an advocate for the trainee. They need to be aware of the educational principles, curriculum and workplace-based assessments and exam requirements, obviously, and teaching and presentation skills and career pathways. I think I'm going to sort of skip this one. And I'm going to skip these. The trainers need to be supported as well as the trainees need to be supported. So the college tutor, director of medical education, and program director are the people we would approach if we are having a problem with a difficult trainee. We can then, if there are issues to do with the college and college policy, then we can work through that. And then there are a whole host of documents, the General Medical Council's Tomorrow's Doctor, doctors, teachers, confidentiality, good medical practice, etc. And colleges' documents on curriculum, exam requirements, and PMED-B documents on generic standards for training. And I think the question really is that educational supervisors must be trained. Resources and time must be made available. They should be given some kind of reward that supervision may count towards their CPD points. And they should have access to various reading materials and the journals such as Medical Teacher. Increasingly, trusts or hospitals encourage us to go for part-time diplomas or certificates in medical education, and I think, again, that's another way of developing skills. So training itself is not a chore. Some trainees may be, but it's a very stimulating, as some trainees are, and it's incredibly enjoyable, as some trainees are. Thank you very much.